Hello students, welcome to chapter 13. So today we are going to be talking about treatments for psychological disorders. We talked a little bit about some treatments last time as we went through psychological disorders in chapter 12. This time we'll focus just kind of on the broad categories of types of therapies that exist for different disorders, and we'll mention a few specific things that work really well for specific kinds of disorders, but mostly we're kind of going over a broad overview of what the different kinds of therapies that are, well, we're going to go over some historical ones as well as some more modern ones and get some ideas of how things have changed from the past to now. So let's get started with that. So first off, we're going to start with talking about therapy and the different kinds of schools of thought there. So with this, therapy is essentially just trying to relieve the suffering of someone who has symptoms of any kind of psychological disorder, whether it be schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, or even if it's something like just general, not generalized anxiety disorder, but just general anxiety in day-to-day life, you might be going to therapy to relieve some of that suffering from that symptom. So there's a psychological approach, biological, and sociocultural. At this point in class, you should probably be able to think for a second and try to figure out what would that psychological approach to therapy be versus biological versus sociocultural. We did mention it a lot last time in chapter 12 too. So hopefully if you pause the video for a second and think about those, you will be able to kind of fill in these bullets before we even talk about them. All right, so psychological approach. This is the kind of sit-down talk therapy we were talking about last time. So a clinical psychologist would very often be doing this. Also, marriage and family therapist, someone who is trained to do this psychological approach is often doing therapy, sitting down, talking, building skills, finding out what the symptoms are of people, doing testing as well, so doing testing for different disorders, so scales, surveys, assessments, cognitive tests, IQ tests, those kinds of things. Oftentimes this is non-medical, but as we talked about last time, in some states, psychologists and people with a PsyD or a PhD can get specialized training and then be able to prescribe medicines. So oftentimes, social workers would also fall into this category as well. Biological approach, mostly there we're talking about medicines. So we will talk about some psychosurgeries as well at the end of class today, and those are also part of the biomedical approach. But mostly what we're talking about is using drugs to treat these symptoms. So psychiatrists, again, are going to be primarily who's doing that, but in some states, psychologists can do that as well. And then sociocultural approach tries to look more at people as a part of the whole context that they're in. So to treat symptoms that might have come from the sociocultural factors around a person, you might have groups of people in the community that are suffering from the same troubles. So let's say a group of people struggling from alcoholism coming together, discussing what helps them, what's hard in their community, what they can do to change things in their community. That's more of a sociocultural approach. So with this, how effective is psychotherapy? So with this, we're talking more about psychotherapy, you can think of that as like the talk therapy, the non-medicine. So we're talking about that exclusively. As we mentioned last time, it's usually best when it's paired with medicine when that's needed. When medicine is needed, it tends to be more effective to pair it with therapy as well. So there are some winners. Evidence-based practice shows that psychotherapy is really good. So what that means is when there's therapies, that have been studied, have had trials, people doing the therapy versus people having treatments with drugs or placebos or no treatments. When comparing all these things, therapy turns out to be one of the most effective ways at reducing symptoms across the board. So obviously there's specific therapies that work better for specific kinds of disorders, but therapy in general is one of the most effective things to reduce symptoms. So with that, evidence-based practice is essentially using up-to-date research. It's kind of a buzzword. So evidence-based practice means the practice that is being used is based in evidence. So it should be using up-to-date research, up-to-date data, up-to-date studies, taking client characteristics into account. So who is this person? What are their sociocultural background? What is their personality? What are some of their strengths? Things like that. Cultural differences. Obviously, you need to be aware of those things of cultural differences as you're trying to treat an individual who's within a culture, within a context. You want to make sure it's tailored to them in a way that will help them and support them. With that being said, do be wary of the just term evidence-based practice. It's often put on a lot of things because it sounds really fancy and good. And that was kind of the intention, is something would be labeled an evidence-based practice if it had been based in evidence and had some evidence for its own treatment. Now you might see, let's say, an e-therapy site or an app that says this is evidence-based practice. And the reason they say that is, one, because no one's really challenging them on it, or like suing them or whatever, but also because some of their ideas might have come from studies and evidence. So let's say there's a couple studies that say mindfulness has these benefits. So they say, oh, okay, so mindfulness has a bunch of benefits, let's do a mindfulness program. But they never actually tested their mindfulness program. They're just using, kind of piggybacking on that previous finding, saying, hey, this is mindfulness, it will work and do these same things, even though their program wasn't actually the one tested. So if you see evidence-based practice, that's not necessarily an indication that it is going to be good. So you now have a bunch of skills for doing research on your own. See if they have sources for their work and their research. Read those original sources, the abstracts, the intros, the discussions. See if you can figure out, is this good? Is the program that they're doing, is it actually what was studied? Or are they kind of piggybacking on it? And depending on how they're piggybacking, it might be relevant. So if they're citing studies that say mindfulness has benefits to decrease stress, the mindfulness program that was tested was 4 weeks long, had this many sessions a day, that kind of thing, and theirs is really similar to that, even though it wasn't their actual program that was tested, you might be able to generalize those findings. Versus if they say, hey, we have this 15-minute mindfulness practice, here, look at all this research on mindfulness, but those are like the multi-week programs. I say, so ours will definitely be good. You can't say that. And be honest about it. So do be wary about that term evidence-based practice. It was originally intended to show that, hey, does have evidence. This is really good. As an example, I think I've given enough examples now, but this one just popped into my mind as well. So I created with a team of psychologists at Claremont Graduate University a purpose fostering activity toolkit. And so we tested each individual activity to see if each individual activity helped foster purpose, help people figure out what they want to do in their lives, what long-term goals are important to them, what they wanted to do outside themselves, like for the world beyond themselves. With that being said, we tested all the individual activities experimentally to see if they worked versus not a placebo, but a alternative option, basically memory skills. What we found was that our activities worked, and then we put them all together, all the ones that work, and we saw that as a whole group over like the course of 4 days, it worked even better. And so that is evidence-based practice. We have evidence, like it's literally on my hard drive. I've got papers published about it. So there's evidence for that specific program. Now, if someone took maybe a piece of that specific program and some things of their own and put it together in their own purpose activities, they might say it's evidence-based practice because they're using some of the same ideas as what we did, but if they didn't actually test theirs, they don't actually have evidence for their program. It might work if they did it well, if they followed some of the critical components that we talk about in our papers of what makes it work well. But if they just think, hey, purpose is a good idea, I think this will foster purpose, and that's usually what you're seeing is sometimes people that aren't masters or PhDs or even have a bachelor's degree in psychology or relevant field, grabbing onto these ideas that they think are really cool and they want to share. Sometimes they're doing that just to get money, but do be careful of it just being evidence-based. So let's jump back to therapy in general. So that was kind of a longer tangent than I intended, but relevant. So what are some factors in having successful psychotherapy? So this isn't just like the digital things that I was just talking about, just overall therapy again. What are some factors to have successful psychotherapy? One of the biggest ones is a therapeutic alliance. And so essentially that is the alliance between the therapist and the patient. So the therapist over there and me, the patient, we need to be aligned on what we want out of this. So the therapist needs to be monitoring the relationship to make sure that alliance is coming along. So in the first meeting, it's probably not going to be there yet, right? You got to get to know this therapist. They've got to get to know you. You've got to start being honest with them and actually talking. So realizing that you both want the same thing, for the symptoms to be decreased and you to do better. So the therapist will monitor that relationship, see if you're getting to that point. Also, the therapist's expertise and personality is really relevant here. So there might be therapists that you just don't really click with, or that don't really click with you, and that's okay. They can still help. Like, it's probably still better than nothing. And also, a therapist's expertise is relevant too. So you can go to someone who practices with a lot of different people, but if you have an anxiety disorder, going to someone who focuses and has done a lot of work on anxiety disorders is probably going to be better than someone who focuses exclusively on, let's say, schizophrenia. So, although honestly, for anxiety disorders was probably a poor choice of example, because so many different disorders cause anxiety in patients. So most therapists are going to be pretty good about anxiety and techniques and skills there. So maybe not the best example there, but let's say, yeah, let's move on. So the client also needs to be actively engaged. So me as the patient, I would need to be actively engaged, and the therapist would monitor that. If the client isn't engaged, if the therapist isn't engaged, if they're not working together to make the client or the patient better, then it's not going to work as well as if everybody's trying hard to work well to do better. As an example of this, when I was doing ABA therapy for minors, so kids under 18, there were some kids that were like 7 or 8 that were really motivated to do the essentially homework, the ABA therapy skills and tasks that we sent them home with. But if the parents didn't have buy-in, they were kind of clients as well. We were trying to teach them different skills to help support the things that their kids were learning. So if the parents didn't have that buy-in, we would see a client like gain some skills over the course of a couple weeks. Then let's say the family goes out for vacation for a week. Then they come back and the client has now reverted. Honestly, for me, that was one of the things that caused the most burnout for me in that field, which is why I'm no longer in that field, actually. So the comparison from that, not having the buy-in from the parent as part of that client relationship versus having parents who were really involved. So we would make advancements with the children. We would teach the parents some of these skills, and then some of the parents would do it, would go off for vacation for a week and keep up with that program, with essentially the reinforcement schedule that we had set for specific behaviors. Then when we came back, we saw the child was even further advanced than the last time we had seen them. So that was always really inspiring and really neat to see. So having that therapeutic alliance, it's not the same, my experience, as like one-on-one therapy with a person, but but that alliance is the same. So the parent and the child and me, we're all aligned in trying to reduce symptoms, give more skills, better that person's life. And also with this, the therapist should be using up-to-date research. So even if you've got an older therapist who's been around for decades, that doesn't matter as much as, are they using new research? Have they been keeping up to date? Are they using modern practices, or are they still using the things that they learned right when they got their degree? That goes for other doctors too, physicians, for example, surgeons, things like that. All right, so let's talk about psychodynamic therapies. Who was a psychodynamic theorist that you remember? Sometimes I feel like Dora the Explorer, asking a question here and kind of just waiting for a moment to see if, obviously, I'm not going to hear anybody's answers. That would be very strange. So with this, a hint, does the idea of psychosexual ring a bell? So one of the most popular, well known, maybe not popular, but well known was Freud. So Freud was a psychodynamic therapist, so hopefully that brings to mind Freud's motivation theories and personality theories, and you can hopefully see how this applies to psychodynamic therapy. So the emphasis here was on early childhood experiences leading to specific behaviors. Remember, the id is a motivator for a lot of our behaviors. It's not consciously available, so the therapist is going to focus on the unconscious conflicts that a person has, the things that that client or patient is not aware of. So the therapist will then interpret things like dreams, interpret their behaviors, their feelings, in light of what is the underlying motivation here. So the goal of therapy is to identify those sources of unconscious conflict, and mostly that's done by talking about them. They might reveal things by just talking about things. They'll see patterns in your behaviors, patterns in the way you talk about people or things or your childhood or your work, maybe looking at your dreams, interpreting your dreams. So some positives of the psychodynamic approach. Again, that was a really brief coverage of it, and mostly a historical view. So with that, it did have success for many problems. It was kind of the first therapy that existed, essentially. So it did support many problems. When there was a positive, supportive relationship, when the therapist and the client wanted to work on something, the clients tended to get better. So it might remind you of that therapeutic alliance we just talked about. And that's one of the first places we saw that as being important. So Freudian psychoanalysis specifically had things like free association, catharsis, interpretation of dream analysis, transference, resistance. Look up these definitions in your textbook. Since I went on a tangent a minute ago, and psychoanalysis is not that big of a thing in the field now, there are still some psychodynamic therapists still working today. They probably aren't using exclusively psychodynamic, and they're not using what Freud was using. So what Freud was using, it's useful to know historically, but not as useful if you're wondering, hey, I want to go to a psychodynamic therapist today. The psychodynamic therapist today instead would be focusing more on sociocultural aspects rather than your id being a motivator, the learned experience, the things that you've learned from your culture and community. What is that kind of driving you or motivating you to do? What are your challenges there? What are your struggles? What are your symptoms? Still doing some of these things like free association and interpretation, still modern times, but definitely a little bit different than Freud. There's now been actual research studies on the techniques, and so those techniques have improved over time. So psychodynamic therapy still exists, is still useful. The reason we're talking about it here from the Freudian perspective is because that's kind of where therapy started, psychotherapy started. So we went from there, and now we're here. So there's still that focus on unconscious thought. Early childhood is still a focus in modern day. Less focus on sex as a motivator. There is a view that the conscious mind is more powerful than Freud gave it credit for, so that's a good change. So again, there's been updates. So humanistic therapists also exist today as well. So the emphasis of this approach, if you think back to a humanistic approach to personality, you might see some parallels here. So the conscious thoughts and someone being in the present here today. The idea of a humanistic psychologist is that people have capacities, they can reach self-actualization, they can work on things themselves, things like that. So the goal here for the therapy is for the self-healing and self-fulfillment for the patient themselves, and the therapist will kind of guide along that path, be there to support them. So the goals of therapy are self-understanding, the patient understanding themselves. Where are those symptoms coming from? Where are their struggles, anxieties? Where is that all coming from? So, and then personal growth, that person becoming their own whole person. So not defined by the therapist, but that the client will kind of discover that with the therapist. Maybe they already have an idea before coming into therapy, and then getting there with the support of the therapist. That's a very humanistic way to look at it. And this is kind of like broad scale. So a really specific example of an early humanistic therapist is Carl Rogers. So with this, he called it non-directive self-exploration, letting the patient explore their own selves, and the therapist being non-directive. The therapist not like pointing to things or leading them down a path, but supporting the patient in their own self-exploration and self-discovery. So a big point of that was to have this warm, supportive atmosphere, to have a place where the patient felt safe, felt like they could talk about things, felt like they could explore their own ideas and thoughts. So there was a lot of active listening, reflective speech, and you'll see that in a video we'll watch in a second. Well, hopefully you pick this out, is that we'll actually watch Rogers with a patient, kind of. I'll explain the video in a second. But Rogers would listen and then kind of reflect the speech of the patient. So they're listening, they're paying attention, they're not trying to plan like what to say next. Instead, they're letting the patient themselves like figure things out or go where they want to go in the conversation. So Rogers will kind of just reflect their speech and restate what they've said in another way, so the patient knows that they're being heard, hears it in another way that might inspire another idea. But that's what that reflective speech is. The therapist is kind of being a mirror to their own things they're saying. Unconditional positive regard, we talked about this, is one thing that it's criticized for, is because even if a patient is saying things that are maybe even harmful or hurtful to self or others, giving them unconditional positive regard, like having that positive atmosphere, not saying, hey, that's not cool, having it be comfortable for them, even if they are, maybe you might be justified in being like, hey, maybe don't do that or something like that. So a big key of this is being empathetic and trying to be really genuine with the person, being there to support them, and hopefully you see that in this interaction. So this video that we'll watch right now on Rogers therapy, that's a later video. So here Rogers and a couple, you can see there's a part 3 here. This is actually still with Rogers there. But here on YouTube you can actually find this person, Gloria, going with a couple different therapists at the time Rogers was live. Obviously this is him. So essentially this documentary was kind of looking at a couple different therapeutical approaches. I think one of it's like a behaviorist approach, this humanistic approach, and I think there was a psychodynamic therapist as well. But you can find that whole documentary on YouTube in pieces, or maybe even the whole thing. It gets taken down sometimes and then appears somewhere else on someone else's channel. So it's here right now. Hopefully the link lasts for when you go and click it. But let's watch some of this interaction, and hopefully you see some of these ideas of humanistic therapy coming through in this video.
If I have any success in creating the kind of conditions that I described initially, then we may be able to see some of these changes in this client, even though I know in advance that our contact is going to be very brief. Good morning.
Hello, Dr.
I'm Dr. Rogers. You must be Gloria.
Yes, I am.
Have this chair.
So I may not have made it clear. So Gloria goes to each of the 3 therapists, and they're there for like half an hour to an hour, just to kind of give people of the day an idea of what these therapies look like. She does have some problems, but it's kind of like she's shopping around for therapy. It's kind of the premise. Yeah. But this is the first time they're ever meeting. So think about the therapeutic alliance. If she's kind of shopping around for therapists right now, that's not a bad thing to do if you have that opportunity and say your insurance covers that, to try out other therapists. But this is definitely a first meeting of these people in a strange context.
Well, we have half an hour together, and I really don't know what we'll be able to make of it, but I hope we can make something of it. I'd be glad to know whatever concerns you.
Well, right now I'm nervous, but I feel more comfortable the way you're talking in a low voice, and I don't feel like you'll be so harsh on me. But,
I hear the tremor in your voice, so there it is.
well, the main thing I want to talk to you about is, I'm just newly divorced, and I had gone in therapy before, and I felt comfortable when I left, and all of a sudden now the biggest change is adjusting to my single life. And one of the things that bother me the most is especially men, and having them into the house, and how it affects the children, and the biggest thing the thing that keeps coming to my mind I want to tell you about is I have a daughter 9 who at one time I felt I had a lot of emotional problems. I wish I could stop shaking. And I'm real conscious of things affecting her. I don't want her to get upset. I don't want to shock her. I want so bad for her to accept me. Mm-hmm. And we're real open with each other, especially about sex. And the other day, she saw a girl that was single but pregnant, and she asked me all about, can girls get pregnant if they're single? And the conversation was fine, and I wasn't at ease at all with her until she asked me if I'd ever made love to a man since I've left her daddy. And I lied to her. And ever since that, it keeps coming up to my mind because I feel so guilty lying to her because I never lie and I want her to trust me. Mm-hmm. And I almost want an answer from you. I want you to tell me if it will affect her wrong if I told her the truth or what.
And it's this concern about her and the fact that you really aren't, that this open relationship that has existed between you now you feel is kind of
Yes, I feel like I have to be on guard about that because I remember when I was a little girl, when I first found out my mother and father made love, it was dirty and terrible, and I didn't like her anymore for a while. And I don't want to lie to Pammy either, and I don't know.
And you sure wish I could give you the answer as to what you should tell her.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
So really good examples here of that reflective speech. So she's literally asking, hey, is it okay I lied to my daughter about this? She wants some validation and support, but rather than give that validation and support about that specific decision, he's giving more of a warm environment where she feels comfortable talking about these things. In his responses, he's basically just saying what she says back to him again. So that's that reflective speech. So rephrasing, he basically said, so you're here because you're worried about how your daughter's going to perceive you now that things have changed in your lives. Basically, he's like repeating what she said, and that inspired her to say more, and they're getting more at what she actually is wanting from this, giving suggestions of anxieties she's having and troubles she's having, so as well as things she's directly telling him that she's struggling with. But he's still not giving like a direction like, hey, you should go and do this, or it was good that you lied to your child, it was bad that you lied to your child. Yeah. We'll watch just a little bit more of this.
Because what you really want is an answer.
I want to especially know if it would affect her if I was completely honest and open with her, or if it would affect her because I lied. I feel like it's bound to make a strain because I lied to her.
Mm-hmm. Sort of feels she'll suspect that, or she will know something's not quite right.
I feel that inside she'll distrust me, yes. Mm-hmm. And also I thought, well, gee, what about when she gets a little older and she finds herself in touchy situations? She probably wouldn't want to admit it to me because she thinks I'm so good and so sweet. Mm-hmm. And yet I'm afraid she could think I'm really a devil. And I want so bad for her to accept me. And I don't know how much a 9-year-old can take.
And really, both alternatives concern you, that she might think you're too good or better than you really are.
Yes.
And she might think that you're worse than you are.
Not worse than I am. I don't know if she can accept me the way I am. I think I paint a picture that I'm all sweet and motherly, and I'm a little ashamed of my shady side, too.
I see. It really cuts a little deeper. If she really knew you, could she accept you?
This is what I don't know, yes. I don't want her to turn away from me. And I don't even know how I feel about it, because there are times when I feel so guilty, like when I have a man over. I even try to make a special setup so that if I were ever alone with him, the children would never catch me and that sort of thing. Because I'm real leery about it. And yet I also know I have these desires.
So it's quite clear. It isn't only her problem or the relationship with her, it's in you as well.
And my guilt, yeah, I feel guilty so often.
What can I accept myself as doing? And,
yes.
And you realize that you set up sort of subterfuges so as to make sure that you're not caught or something. You realize that you are acting from guilt, is that?
Yes.
So hopefully you can see just with this short interaction that Rogers is trying to help her discover things about herself, maybe things she already even knows or realizes, but kind of putting words to it, and then go on and make decisions for herself about what is she going to do. How does she feel about lying to her child versus not? Is she going to accept herself for who she is, and also be honest with the child, versus another kind of therapist, for example, might actually give advice, say, well, something like, Research shows on average that for a child of that age, parents tend to lie about certain things, especially about their own sexual lives, and it doesn't seem to negatively affect children. However, an open relationship is really key as they get into adolescence, so that they'll be more comfortable talking to you. So kind of give a couple options, and give some of the research, or maybe even give it a suggestion and say, so based on that, I would suggest maybe being honest. So there might be another therapist who would do something like that. Bring in the research and say, hey, this is X, Y, Z, so this is kind of, you're wondering about the past. So another therapist might do that, but not a humanistic therapist. So yeah, this is where the different perspectives can be a little different in that way. But let's move on to another form of therapy. But hopefully that gives you a lot better idea of the humanistic approach to therapy. So the behavioral therapies. ABA is a behavioral therapy, applied behavioral analysis. So some of the examples I've given throughout class, and if you think back to our chapters on classical and operant conditioning, that's what we're talking about in go away. Okay, there we go. That's what we're talking about, behavioral therapies. So the emphasis of this is on the outright behaviors. So are there hitting behaviors? Are there screaming or biting behaviors? Is the behavior that the child is not looking at people's faces when they're talking? ABA is often used for children with autism to try and help them kind of match socio-normative interactions, kind of act the proper way, looking at people and talking to them, things like that as a neurotypical person might be more natural to you. So with that, the idea for behavioral therapies is on the overt behaviors, the things you can see, the things you can observe, the yelling, the biting, the hitting, getting really frustrated about when you're getting mad. So the goals of the therapy are to reduce or eliminate those observable behaviors. So the biting behavior, you don't want that to continue. You don't want a 13-year-old yelling at their teacher every day and fighting in class and disrupting everybody else's learning, those kinds of things. So you'd use both classical and operant conditioning for behavioral therapies, as well as more recently, more social cognitive approaches. So the original behavioral therapies would, just like original behaviorists, were really focused on just the behaviors, on just those behaviors, the conditioning. Now there's more of that social cognitive approach included in there, because realizing with the research, hey, we need to not ignore all the cognitions a human has. So classical conditioning techniques, we saw this systematic desensitization. So we saw this in our example weeks ago of the patient with a snake. So they were getting desensitized to that. Their fear response was not so large as they had a little bit of experience with the snake, and then more and more and more experience with the snake. So with that, you might also apply relaxation when imagining fearful things. You might do VR where it's, let's say it's a snake. So there's a shape kind of like a snake. Then you get to like more and more clear as you get more desensitized, or maybe the snake's further away, and then in the VR you can like walk to it. So aversive conditioning also is pairing undesirable behavior with aversive stimuli. As an example, if you wanted to do a behavioral therapy for the behavior of nail biting, you could put some like gross tasting nail polish on, and that would be an aversive stimulus that then would be associated with the learning of biting nails, and that would hopefully stop the nail biting. Didn't work for me as a kid. I just kept licking the bitter, gross stuff off until I could finally bite my nails again. So my intrinsic motivation pushed through that gross tasting stuff. So here's another example using, let's say you're trying to stop using alcohol or stop using cigarettes. You might pair that substance with a nauseating drug. So there's specific drugs that if you take and then you also have alcohol or smoke a cigarette, it will then make you feel really nauseous. So that is another example of aversive conditioning, trying to stop you from doing this maybe bad habit that you want to stop, and pairing it associatively with this feeling of nausea. All right, so operant conditioning techniques are things, again, operant conditioning, the patient or the client is more active, making choices, doing things, and then getting a consequence. So you might be you may be unlearning maladaptive behavior and getting shaped through altering consequences. So when learning to focus on doing a math lesson, you might give a reinforcement, give a candy, or give a star sticker, something like that. So with applied behavioral analysis, it's very often using positive reinforcement. At least when I was working, we never used either positive or negative punishment. It was almost always positive reinforcement, just because it's a lot easier to add something to the situation that will reinforce. So praise, stars on a star chart, candy, time to go and play a video game, things like that. Reinforcements are a lot easier. With that, we're trying to extinguish maladaptive behaviors, so like the behavior of like yelling at people when mad. So we might try to shift that over to stepping away, taking a breath. So we'd shape that. If we see a client getting mad, sometimes we would even play games like Monopoly and cheat. Like, it sounds terrible, but I would literally cheat with the clients so that they would get mad, and then they would have a chance to work on adjusting their emotions. So we would tell them beforehand, hey, we're going to work on taking breaths when mad today. So, hey, let's go play Sorry. And then I don't even remember the game Sorry, but let's say I was supposed to move 3 spaces, but if I moved 3 spaces, something bad would happen, so I would move 4 spaces instead. The child would then get mad and start getting frustrated, and we would then reinforce them if they did the behavior of like walking away from the board, taking a breath, counting to 10, whatever anger management technique we were trying to get them to work on. Then I'd give them maybe a candy, a star on their star chart, something like that. Oftentimes the clients where I worked, they like to work for going to a local game store if they did well, like if they got enough stars. They would then go to a local game store and play video games for the last 15 minutes of our session, or play a game of dodgeball. So that was fun. So with that, these behavioral therapies, they're not focused on helping the child gain insights onto why do they get angry or things like that. But it can be really effective in children to have that, hey, do this task instead of this task, and you'll get reinforced, rewarded. With that, you do need, say, parents or teachers, because I also work with kids in the school system, so you need a plan and have other people on board too to support them in their other contexts that they're in. Otherwise, even if we have them for 20-hour sessions a week, well, not like as one time. I wasn't there with a client for like almost an entire day. It was spread over the course of a few days. But even with that many hours, they still need that support and training outside the home too. All right, so let's move to cognitive therapies. So again, cognitive psychology focuses on the mind, mental processes, working memory. How are you processing things? How is intelligence being used? How are you sensing and perceiving things? So the emphasis of this approach is on your thoughts, on your cognitions, and that they might be a primary source, one of, or maybe even the primary source of problems that you have. So you have anxieties. Maybe that's all based on your thoughts around the upcoming final. So it makes sense to be a little nervous about it, but maybe you're really, really extra nervous because you're ruminating on that. Your thoughts are causing you this distress. So some assumptions here for the cognitive approach is that people can control their thoughts, at least to some degree, that people can control their feelings. Again, this is one reason that behavioral therapies are really good for younger children. They haven't gained the capacity yet. They're still learning that capacity of emotion regulation. Obviously my example of that anger management technique, that's an example of, hey, you're using and you're learning that technique now. In middle school, high school, for an adult, they should be a lot better at controlling their feelings. Maybe adolescence was a bad example. Adolescence, you've got that time where the amygdala is myelinating and then you're feeling more and stronger emotions than other times in your life. So it can be more difficult than in early puberty as well. So with that, people can think back to events that have happened, their experiences, maybe a traumatic experience, for example, and reinterpret and evaluate that and think about it in new light now. That would be something a cognitive therapy would do. So the emphasis is on those. Some of this is a little repetitious, sorry about that. So we can think and control how we feel about things, how we think about things. We're focusing on overt problems. So, hey, I'm feeling anxious about finals coming up. And it's really bothering me. I can't sleep very well. So we'll focus on those specific problems. So what are some skills you can learn to sleep better? What are some cognitive skills you can learn to help clear your mind to be able to sleep better? What are some things you can do to feel less anxious about finals? Are your fears justified or are they not? Those kinds of things. Sorry if I'm making you feel more anxious about finals. It's just a relevant example, right? We're in a school context and setting here. There's exams, so it's a relevant example. Sorry if it makes you more anxious, though. There's structured analysis and specific guidance in cognitive therapies. So a cognitive therapist would say, okay, you're anxious about this upcoming test. Here are 3 skills that you could gain and learn to reduce that anxiety. So this would be an example that would be very unlike Rogers and the humanistic therapy, where they would kind of repeat back to you, okay, you're feeling anxious, and let the patient kind of figure out like how to deal with that anxiety. A cognitive therapist might say, hey, here's some options. Choose which one you think is good. We'll try that one. If that one doesn't work, come back, we'll try another one. As an example. So the goals of therapy are cognitively restructuring things like trauma, for example. Restructuring that in how you think about it, how you process it, so when you remember it, it doesn't trigger you anymore, but maybe when you remember it, you can kind of let it go. With that, you look for, are there illogical, automatic, negative thoughts? So do you feel bad about yourself as a person, and is that just an automatic process that you've now gained? Let's work on that. Let's make that not the automatic process anymore. Identify and challenge those automatic thoughts. So if you have bad ideas or feelings about yourself, you can challenge those. Irrational and self-defeating beliefs, like I believe I won't ever succeed, or I won't do well, or I'm not going to be able to do this new job I was hired for. So working on those, so that's not your default. That's not what you automatically go to. Instead, you maybe even if you do go to that, you can stop and think and realize, oh, so I'm defaulting to this self-defeating belief. I need to do whatever skill or technique so then I can focus on something else and push through and do well in life. So oftentimes we ignore evidence of the positives in our own life, especially when we have any of these kinds of disorders. So if you've got an imbalance of serotonin in your brain, you might just tend to ignore the positives in your own life. It's one of the symptoms. It happens. So focusing on that rather than overgeneralizing negatives, focus on things that are positive, restructure the way you're thinking about those negatives. So these are things that we often do and you would work on in a cognitive therapy situation. So Albert Bandura was an example of a cognitive theorist, as well as had some ideas about cognitive therapy. So self-efficacy was a big one. If you give patients skills and then they start using those skills and their life has improved, their symptoms are diminished, things are getting better, they will feel good about themselves because they've accomplished something. That's what self-efficacy is. So like self-esteem is like your general beliefs about yourself. Like, I think I'm a really good person, or actually, no, that's not a good example. So I like myself or I don't like myself is more like self-esteem. So I have esteem of myself or I don't have esteem of myself. That's self-esteem. Self-efficacy is, hey, I think I can do things. Hey, this challenge is coming up. I think I can, or I believe I can get through this, or I believe I can accomplish things. And self-efficacy comes from having accomplished things. So maybe a sad example, but then a positive example too. I was recently trying to learn French again. I tried it in high school. I always got like C pluses. One, maybe I wasn't paying that close of attention in high school to the class as well as other things in the context of high school. Another, it was just a struggle. Like obviously, cognitively, neurologically, it's easier to learn a language when you're really young rather than when you're in high school. So recently, I've started trying to learn French again through like an app, Duolingo. Not a paid advertisement. Also not a paid advertisement because they probably wouldn't want me saying this. It didn't seem to be working for me. So I would do a couple lessons a day, but then I would go back and review older lessons and I would just not remember any of it. I wouldn't remember the words. I wouldn't remember verb tenses. I hate verb tenses. They're the worst. Me myself, like a little bit of self-disclosure here, I don't have much self-efficacy in my ability to learn new languages. I don't know that that's a skill that I have. It's probably something I could gain, but the tools of Duolingo did not work for me. I'm guessing there are other tools that might work better for me, but right now I'm just going to take a break from it. So I don't have self-efficacy in that. I do have self-efficacy in my ability to learn to play instruments. So I'm still not very good at, say, guitar, but I am able to see when I practice and when I'm repeatedly practicing and I come back to it even a couple weeks later or the next day and play a song that I've played before, I can do that. Like, I can see myself getting better at those skills, and so I have self-efficacy in learning instruments and playing music. So that's what self-efficacy is, like feeling that you can do something in a given situation. So situation of learning a new language, I have very low self-efficacy there. Situation of doing research and doing studies, self-efficacy is really high in that. My self-efficacy in playing music is pretty high in that as well. So what Albert Bandura and cognitive behavioral therapists would do is try and get you self-efficacy in those areas that you're struggling. So you're struggling with anxiety around tests, give you skills, and then you would see yourself doing better on tests because you're applying those skills, and you would gain self-efficacy and be like, hey, I have learned these skills, I can do well in tests, or I can do well in one-on-one interactions with people. I can do well in talking with my my ex when I have to drop off my kid or something like that. So you'll gain self-efficacy, and that's one of the goals, is to gain the skills, gain the techniques, to then have self-efficacy in those kinds of situations that are relevant to your symptoms in your everyday life. It does often incorporate behavioral therapy. So cognitive behavioral therapy specifically is that cognitive piece plus the behavioral piece combined. So CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, seems to be as effective or more effective than other forms of psychotherapy, or psychological medications. So in studies where you compare someone who's going just to cognitive behavioral therapy, someone who's going just to like a humanistic therapy, or someone going just to a, groups, not just individual people, but groups going to cognitive behavioral therapy, humanistic, versus just taking medicine for, let's say, depression. So going to all of those for symptoms of depression. You probably wouldn't do a behaviorist treatments for depression. So let's say psychodynamic, cognitive behavioral, and medicine. So in studies where they've done that with big groups, they've seen that cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be as effective or more effective than other treatments. And then it's even better when, let's say you have severe depression, you add cognitive behavioral therapy plus medicine. That is really, really good. So depression, anxiety, alcohol or drug use problems, marital problems, eating disorders, severe mental illness, all of these have been treated really effectively with cognitive behavioral therapy. That's one of the reasons that it's one of the most popular and most widely used right now, is because it does seem to be so effective. Will there be more effective things and changes to cognitive behavior therapy in the future? I certainly hope so. I certainly hope the tools that we're using get better and people are researching and trying to use new techniques and bring in aspects that we might have seen effective in, say, a sociocultural therapy into cognitive behavioral therapy. So there is a movement to try and bring in basically all the good evidence and try to incorporate it into one kind of method and model for therapy. While that's good too, you also have to say, well, hey, for a child, maybe a specific behavioral therapy might be really effective for this individual versus for their parents in their marriage. Cognitive behavioral therapy in their marital problems, that might be most effective. So kind of got to be a jack of all trades there. I think that was kind of repetitive there. So with treatment, it will focus on changing your own thinking patterns about things. So you'll recognize your own distortions about things. So whether it's for depression or anxiety or struggles with interpersonal relationships, you'll recognize your own distortions, the way you're thinking that's not quite right, like you're holding on to the negative rather than thinking of the whole actual real picture, or you're ignoring the positive and just focusing on that negative. So you reevaluate those things in light of reality. So the therapist would kind of call you out on it, be like, hey, look at it in this perspective. You'll gain an understanding of your own and other people's motivations. A lot of people will say that's one of the big things they gain from cognitive behavioral therapy, is learning why people act the way that they do. And that can be really helpful for especially interacting with other people. If you understand their motivations, it can be easier to, even if they do something that is maybe annoying or harmful to you, you can understand why, and that makes it easier for you yourself. So with that, you will also be learning problem solving and coping skills. So learning breathing techniques, learning meditation techniques, learning ways to restructure or organize your life so your memory improves, things like that. And then as you succeed, as you make changes and see progress, you'll build self-efficacy. You'll build that understanding that you can overcome these problems, you can overcome these symptoms, you can see them decrease in your life and have your life get better because of what you're doing. And so that's really powerful and helpful for people to see that improving over time. Although it does take time, it does take work. So facing fears instead of avoidance. So for behavior specific, this is some of that behavioral piece of the cognitive behavioral. You might do specific behavioral reinforcing tricks for yourself. You might reinforce yourself for doing specific behaviors, for doing the homework that the therapist gives you. You might even do role play with the therapist, or even like a VR setting to prepare for interactions with others. You might do, if you're having a lot of anxiety around interviewing, you might do mock interviews with your therapist. They might give you a app or a tool or a VR thing so that you can practice that and role play and prepare. Use the new skills that you've built and see, does this work? Does this one work? And you'll learn to be more calm in your mind, and you'll be able to learn to relax your body so that if, say, something's triggering you, you can recognize that, reframe your thinking, and work through it and succeed in what you're trying to do. In many ways, essentially, cognitive behavioral therapy is a patient learning skills that work for them so that the patient themselves can become their own therapist, can support their own self through life. So they're gaining that self-efficacy, they're learning those skills that work for them. So I mentioned in the chapter on memory, like I've learned a couple memory skills and tricks that help me specifically. That's kind of what we're getting at here, is that like that wasn't guided like by a therapist. I was just like, hey, I've learned all this stuff in memory courses. I should try these out, and then finding out what works for me. A cognitive behavior therapist would be like, hey, here is tool A, B, C, try them all, see what works for you. If you find B works for you, then you know that for your own future. So it helps to be that individual too, because if A works for me and B works for you and C works for someone else, it's good for them to have those options, right? All right, so let's watch just this short cartoon. It kind of emphasizes some of the pieces that some of the points that we've made just now about cognitive behavioral therapy and some of the other therapies as well. This second video is also really good. It's a couple actual people talking about their own experience with cognitive behavioral therapy, things they got out of it. They give a little bit of descriptions about what they actually did in cognitive behavioral therapy, like what some of the tasks and skills they were learning were. But I think it's a really good one for them talking about their experience. But I think this one does a better job of emphasizing some of the points we're making. So let's watch this short one first. And actually, we won't watch the other one together as a class, but feel free to do it on your own time.
Last saw Alex. He was struggling with depression. He hadn't looked for help because he thought others might think he's weak. And he didn't think anything would help. Then, Alex learned about a new counseling treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, for depression, that helped his friend Joe and other vets.
Hello.
After learning more, Alex decided to give CBT treatment a try. At the start of treatment, Alex and his therapist Lisa worked together to set goals for things he wanted to change in his life. Over the next few months, they worked as a team to reach these goals. First, Alex learned depression can result from spending little time doing things that are enjoyable or productive. Alex mostly watched TV, which often made him feel worse. So, he and Lisa worked together to figure out activities that would make him feel better and more productive. This included taking daily rides to the park, cooking dinner a couple of nights a week, and spending a few moments each morning looking for new jobs. At first, getting going was hard. Alex told Lisa he thought about quitting treatment. Talking about this helped. Lisa understood, and it helped him make it more manageable. As Alex started to take small steps, he started feeling more confident. At each session, Alex filled out a questionnaire to see if his mood was improving, and it was. He was also starting to accomplish things, which made Alex start to feel better about himself. Next, Alex learned how our mood is connected to our thoughts. He realized he carried around a lot of negative thoughts, like that he wouldn't succeed and the worst would happen in situations. This was a lot to tug around. Lisa explained it's like he looks at himself and life through dark and foggy lenses. And this made a lot of sense to Alex. When he was young, he was told he was not good enough, and part of him now believes this. Alex learned skills to step back and clear up how he sees himself. After a few months, Alex was feeling more like his old self. His thinking became more balanced, and he was hopeful about his future.
Oh, wow.
So if you're feeling down and you want to make real changes in your life, there is effective help available. Take the next step forward. Learn more about proven treatments and how to find help at treatmentworksforvets.org.
So it's kind of funny because it's set in a way of like this is an advertisement for cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's actually a pretty good one at that. So it really goes to show a couple of the specific aspects that are going to happen in cognitive behavioral therapy. You'll sit down, talk about problems, talk about why you're there. Hopefully there's going to be that therapeutic alliance being built. You'll be honest, the therapist is going to click with you well, and you'll both be working towards those positive outcomes, and you'll set goals. Things that you want, symptoms that you want to reduce, these overt problems that we talked about. Alex was then learning skills and learning to change things about his life and his context to help support him. I can definitely attest to motorcycle rides having an antidepressant effect, unless you go out to ride and then like you've got to do maintenance on your bike. Then it's like, oh man. But then the maintenance, never mind. That's way different tangent. I'm missing riding my motorcycle because it's too cold right now and it's sitting in the garage all lonely. No, the motorcycle has no feelings. But no, he's doing things. The point is, motorcycling is a good thing for me personally as well. But Alex was doing things that he talked about with a therapist, doing his homework, trying to do those skills and seeing himself improve, getting tests and assessments, not necessarily weekly depending on what you're doing. But then being able to see himself improve, he had more self-efficacy. He was able to try new things. He gave more motivation to do things. So CBT is really effective for depression. It's really effective for a lot of other disorders that we've talked about too. So where was that list that we had? Oh, I'm going the wrong way. So depression, anxiety, alcohol or drug use problems, marital problems, eating disorders, severe mental illness, cognitive behavioral therapy can be a piece of useful treatment for schizophrenia even as well. So there's a lot of things CBT can be really useful for. It's one of the most popular right now, most common because it has some of the strongest evidence for it. So a lot of therapists that you'll find are going to be doing CBT. All right, so now that we've got a better idea of that, let's talk about e-therapy interventions or teletherapy. Because it's called teletherapy because originally it started on telephone. So way back before internet and video calls and we were doing broadcasts like this, there was telephones. And so therapy even started with that. So the teletherapy started because telephone therapy. So now we have smartphones that we can have our little screens right in front of our faces. We can talk directly with the therapist. We can go on a computer with a webcam and talk this way. So there are more opportunities for that. There's even a lot of companies making apps and programs to do some of the therapy, kind of like offload some of that therapy onto robots. So whether it be assessments, doing assessments or like a questionnaire every week before a therapy session, that would be a really good thing for an app. We'll talk about some of the weaknesses of apps in a second. They could and can be really good. So, but most of the research on teletherapy is on doing actual therapy techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy from a distance. So doing the same cognitive therapy technique, setting goals on a distance, on video or on a phone call. So doing the same therapies just on that. So that is another weakness of some of the research in e-therapy and teletherapy, is that it's often not testing the specific medium it's being delivered by, but I think I'm getting ahead of myself there. So cyber therapy, internet-based, Skype with therapists, you're probably pretty used to that now. A lot of the world has gotten a lot more used to distance kind of meetings and whatnot because of the pandemic. So with that, doing cyber therapy and having companies that offer exclusively cyber therapy is a little controversial, especially because some sites don't include therapist qualifications. You might say on the site, hey, I want treatment for, or I want help with anxiety, and then they just kind of like funnel you somewhere. It's not always clear to the patient why you're getting placed with this person, and for some places it's just whoever's available. For some places they are directly putting you with someone who has expertise in that area. So it's sometimes hard to figure out, is the company doing that, like placing you well, or just kind of funneling you so that the company can just have you in their company and paying them money. With that, usually e-therapy interventions and teletherapy is really effective. It doesn't seem to be that much less effective doing the same kind of technique. So if you sat down one-on-one with a person in an office doing cognitive behavioral therapy versus at a distance, if you're having the same number of sessions, the same kinds of things being suggested, it doesn't seem to be any less effective. But there are some things that it's not very effective for. It's not very helpful for things like suicidal patients, so someone who needs someone with them right there to support them, like in the physical space. It can't do that, obviously. So there are weaknesses to it. There are those limitations because it's at distance. There's also the limitation of a person might not have the capacity to do teletherapy, not have like a webcam or a phone that can handle the internet or the data connection or have enough minutes to do things. So there's also that. So the positives, though, is that even though there's those weaknesses, it can make therapy available even outside of like a pandemic situation. It can make therapy available to a lot of clients who wouldn't otherwise have access to therapy. So let's say you live in a real rural area. It takes you an hour to drive to the nearest town or more. It's going to be hard to go and run your errands and then also do therapy if you're only going into town once every other week or something like that. Having more therapy sessions is generally going to be better. So if you're having 2 teletherapy sessions a week and then only going into town once a week, that's going to be a lot more effective for you. So it makes that therapy available to a lot wider array of clients. Some people, just because of their schedules, they literally just don't have time to go to therapy. So being able to just have that scheduled time where they can sit down at their computer or their phone and have part of it just run by an app when they can do it like when they're able to, that is really effective at getting more people into doing therapy because it's more convenient that way. So if you're interested in becoming a therapist, I know a lot of psychology students, they take psych classes because they're interested in psych. A lot of them think, hey, maybe I want to help people. That's one of the biggest motivations for people going into psych is, hey, I want to help people. One of the main ideas, because that's kind of what most people know about psychology, is they do therapy. So a lot of people have that goal of, I want to be a therapist. So if you still do at this time, we've talked about a lot of other options up to this point in class. If you still do want to be a therapist, like that's great. But if you go through with it, do be careful if you're going to do teletherapy and of the companies that are hiring you. So similar to like a ride sharing, that's the word I was looking for, or ride sharing app. So like Lyft or Uber. So essentially a therapist in some of these companies, it's just like you're an independent contractor and the company is hosting you and they're getting a lot of money from their patients that are seeing you, but you might not necessarily be getting the protections you need, and the clients, your patients, might not be getting the safety and security that they need as well. So do your due diligence. Checking on the companies if you're wanting to have them hire or host you. as a therapist. So one thing that some apps just don't do is they don't have secure and encrypted traffic for the communications between patients and therapists. That's not really a great thing. You want to have, in a face-to-face therapy session, you'd have a room where it's private. It's you and the therapist and whoever you bring with you, or whoever the therapist brings with them and asks that you can be there. If you're sending signals with very pertinent details, fears, uncomfortable thoughts, you don't want that to be out in the public, right? So making sure that there's that security. The businesses that are hiring these therapists or hosting them might not necessarily be looking out for the therapist's best interests, so do your due diligence. There's a couple recommendations on the APA website, and I haven't checked all of these recommendations, but other therapists have recommended them highly, so still do your due diligence with these lists and these links. But here's a couple options. So telehealth is one of the biggest organizations, so hopefully they're doing better. Again, I haven't checked on them, but they're a recommendation from the APA, so I'm kind of side-loading. Hey, maybe they're good. Check it out. So these are also relevant links if you want to get teletherapy, if you want that e-therapy for yourself as the patient. Like this kind of slide is focused on, hey, if you want to be a therapist, check into the companies you're going to be working for. Make sure everything's on the up and up. But these links are also relevant if you're wanting to search for, as a patient, teletherapy services. So here's a bunch of other links. This is actually on the APA website. In the slide, you won't be able to click the links because it's just a screenshot of the website. So with that, a lot of these apps, a lot of these programs, a lot of the methods that they might be advertising on specific apps specifically, I'm using the word specifically a lot. If you're doing therapy with a person and you're having a video conference call and you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, you're setting goals, you're making plans, you're being taught skills, and you're doing those things, that's probably pretty good. It's probably pretty similar, and you can generalize the research findings for cognitive behavioral therapy to that situation. But if they have their own app to kind of replace a part of that whole process with a therapist, they have their own specific methods and programs. If they haven't actually empirically tested that tool, it might not actually be that great. It might be great. Like, you can create an app that's fantastic and does really great therapy, but we really want to, as psychologists now, and as people that are a lot more educated in psychology, you want to be able to see the research, see the data that says, hey, this is effective. So if they're advertising their own specific apps and programs, see if there is like a research link on their site where you can check and evaluate for yourself if that's useful. If all you're doing is video conferencing with a therapist, you're probably in good hands there. Check the credentials of your therapist, check the safety and security of the site, those kinds of things, because you want it to be secure, your data to be secure. Yeah, I think that's all the main points that I wanted to hit here. So again, that link is on the APA website. With that, even outside of COVID, since COVID, it's led about 75% of providers to exclusively provide teletherapy. So that's a big shift. Whereas it used to be an option, some patients like to do it, we've moved to 3/4 and even more exclusively providing teletherapy. Again, so some symptoms, some cases, some patients are not going to be able to do as well with teletherapy. So for that essential need, you might need a one-on-one contact. But outside of a pandemic, some therapists also do e-therapy either exclusively just on their own or as a supplement with clients. So one colleague of mine, he moved out of town. Either he or his client moved. But they're still working together, even though they're a couple hundred miles apart from each other, because they had that therapeutic alliance. They had a good relationship in their therapy. They'd been working together for 2 years at that point. So the therapist is still the therapist to that client now, rather than them coming into their office every week. They're doing a video conference every week. So there's those options. Yeah, so with this talk about the effectiveness of different therapies, honestly, the integration, and this shouldn't be too surprising since a lot of what we've talked about in psychology is, hey, we used to be these separate schools, and now we've kind of combined, and we realize, hey, we all have to work together to make people better and learn about psychology. Same thing with therapy. We had the humanistic school, we had this psychodynamic school, we had the behaviorist school, then we have cognitive behaviorist, or the cognitive school, and then they started to combine and realize, hey, if we take tools from that one and that one and that one and that one, we can combine into an integration that uses the most effective tools and techniques from each of the types of therapies, combines them into a whole, and sees what works best for any individual. So this therapy integration model is the best. You definitely want to use the kinds of tools that will work the best. All right, so ADHD, for example, having cognitive behavioral therapy plus drug therapy is pretty effective. Depression, especially for severe depression. Cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be pretty much the greatest thing for most levels of depression, and then once you get to that level of having severe depression, adding in the medicine at that point seems to be the best. So figuring out and researchers finding out those kinds of facts is really useful. All right, so let's talk about some of these biological therapies, and then we'll end with some psychosurgeries. So biological therapies are focusing on the body. Usually we're talking about drugs here, but we'll also talk about electroconvulsive and electroconvulsive therapy and psychosurgery. But let's focus on drugs first. So for anxiety, you'd probably be using anti-anxiety drugs. Tranquilizers, these are intended to induce calm in a person. So benzodiazepines, for example, Zantac, Valium, and many others. Like you can just look up. There's so many different names for different drugs. So with that, a lot of these, the tranquilizers specifically, often only treat symptoms temporarily, and they can also become addictive, so it's not always the greatest option. He walked right through the video.
Sorry.
It's fine. Did he have pants?
He has this dress on.
Okay. The dress is fine. I just thought I saw a lot of leg, and I was hoping his butt wasn't on the video. All right, so another option, and one of the most common drugs actually, just period, is SSRIs. So that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And then SNRIs are also pretty common, a little less common than the SSRIs, because the SNRIs are selective, oh goodness, I forgot the neurotransmitter, reuptake inhibitor though, but it's one that starts with an N. It'll come to my mind in a minute. But SSRIs tend to have, they work on serotonin in the brain. They tend to have the least side effects. This is a really good video on it. It's really detailed about what SSRIs and SNRIs do, but we won't show it in class. If you want to watch it yourself, it is really detailed, but it's a little bit slow. You might find it boring, but you might find it useful. So it's there if you want to watch it. So antidepressant drugs are there to regulate mood. Oftentimes they're trying to influence serotonin in the brain. SSRIs, like we were just talking about. So this allows an increase or maintenance of the level of those specific neurotransmitters. So let's watch this video in class. It's similar to the other one, but it's a little faster paced and a little more interesting, a little more different visuals in it. So let's watch this one to learn what some antidepressants are doing at the neural level.
SSRIs were developed in the 1970s with the goal of treating depression by increasing serotonin levels. This goal was formulated based on the serotonin hypothesis of depression, which suggests that depression is caused by low levels of the neurotransmitter serotonin. SSRIs work by inhibiting a mechanism called reuptake. In reuptake, a protein called a transporter transports excess neurotransmitter molecules out of the synaptic cleft, usually back into the neuron that released them. SSRIs inhibit the reuptake of serotonin. By inhibiting the removal of serotonin from the synaptic cleft, This causes levels of serotonin in the synaptic cleft to rise. These increases in serotonin levels have been hypothesized to be the mechanism by which SSRIs can treat the symptoms of depression. There are reasons now, however, to believe that there must be more to the mechanism of SSRIs than just changing serotonin levels. For example, when someone begins taking an SSRI, they generally have to wait about 4 weeks before their symptoms improve. Evidence suggests, however, that their serotonin levels rise as quickly as within an hour after taking the medication. Thus, it seems likely that SSRIs may affect serotonin levels, which then leads to other effects that influence the symptoms of depression. Therefore, it's probable that more than serotonin levels must be changed for SSRIs to work, which suggests that depression isn't caused only by low serotonin levels. Additionally, evidence has now emerged that questions the effectiveness of SSRIs. Some research has found they do not work much better than placebos, and may only benefit those who are most severely depressed, which is a minority of patients who actually take the drugs.
So some key pieces there are, one, if you're seeking for treatment for depression specifically, it does seem for SSRIs they can increase serotonin levels almost immediately, but the actual effects of these medicines aren't felt for even sometimes up to 4 weeks. The average is like 2 to 3. So with that, you go to a therapist, you decide, hey, your depression's severe enough, you should be taking this medicine, because like it mentioned as well, people who don't have as severe depression, it doesn't seem like the medicines really do any good. So if, for example, you have depression and you're still on medicine, but it's been getting better, maybe even talk to your doctor about getting off the medicine, see if the symptoms stay the same. But again, don't just stop taking a medicine that's prescribed by your doctor, but it's worth it to know, like, this is what we know about it, is that for less severe cases of depression, medicines don't seem to be very effective. So if that's your case, then maybe saving that money might be more useful, and doing more of the cognitive skills, upping your time at the therapist might have a better effect. So talk to your doctor about that. Don't just make that decision on your own. Don't just make that decision because I just said to. Talk to your doctor about the most recent research. But also, if you do stop taking or start taking a new medicine, a different SSRI, or you jump from an SSRI to an SNRI and then back, you've got to wait a couple weeks in between that transition time to see if it's being effective. And so that's a long time to wait for someone who especially has severe depression, is waiting for some release from their symptoms, some decrease of that symptoms. So with that being said, though, SSRIs are one of the most common prescribed because they have some of the fewest side effects. They might not be one of the most effective at just kind of destroying those symptoms, but because they have so few side effects in most people, they're one of the most recommended. So that is one of the main. There are other drugs that are used for depression and other things too, but some of them have a higher chance of bad side effects. Depending on what it is, it might also be addictive. So the option is usually, hey, let's use the least risky thing that might help first. So yeah, many of these do improve depression a little bit, and some of them do have significant side effects. Most take about 2 weeks or more to work. SSRIs, like we just heard, 2 to 4 weeks. And with that, things that influence serotonin. Serotonin is one of the however many neurotransmitters in our brain. So serotonin does a lot of different things. So we've seen some treatment from SSRI specifically for anxiety, sleep, chronic pain, ADHD. So for the medicine I took with ADHD as a teenager was actually a SSRI. So it's different than other options for ADHD are also stimulants. And so for some patients, stimulants will work, some an SSRI will work. And that's because serotonin does a lot of different things in the brain. And so even as that video was talking about, it's not exactly clear how exactly serotonin in all aspects is affecting the whole process of depression symptoms. So another option is tricyclics. This increases both norepinephrine, that's the one that starts with the N, and serotonin. It is one of the most effective drugs. Tetracyclics increase norepinephrine and serotonin, and monoamine oxidase inhibitors block the reabsorption of a lot of different neurotransmitters. So the SSRIs only stops that serotonin being reuptaked. The SNRIs do the serotonin and norepinephrine, keep that in the synaptic cleft, so the space between the axon branch and the other dendrite. So, yeah. For bipolar disorder, one common treatment is lithium. It does treat the episodes of mania really well, but it may not improve the depression symptoms. So for someone with bipolar disorder, maybe most of the time they will be on a depression medicine or an antidepressant medicine, an SSRI. And then during a period of mania, psychiatrists might then prescribe them lithium to help deal with those symptoms of mania. It is really toxic, so it's very carefully monitored. Other antipsychotic drugs reduce tension, decrease hallucinations in patients, like neuroleptics. They affect dopamine pathways in the brain, and we've talked about a lot of different ways dopamine affects our brain and neurotransmitters and neural signals. So it is useful in treating schizophrenia symptoms, but it can also have a lot of side effects because dopamine and serotonin do a whole bunch in the brain. So other medicines, tardive dyskinesia is a side effect that causes involuntary muscle movement in the face, tongue, mouth, and arms. So that can be really bad. So depending on your reaction to it, you might get that worse, that involuntary muscle movement, very, very little or very much. So it'll depend on, is that involuntary muscle movement, is that interfering with your job more than your schizophrenia symptoms? Well, so then you'll probably talk to your doctor and stop using that medicine. So there are atypical antipsychotic medicines that affect dopamine and serotonin. There's a lot of different medicines that have been tried. So most patients show improvement with small doses of a variety of different medicines, or with like figuring out which specific medicine works for them and their symptoms. And then with therapy. So therapy plus medicine tends to be the most effective for most things. Not every disorder, but for most things. ADHD, depression, anxiety. So let's move over to some other biological therapies. Let's talk about electroconvulsive therapy. So you've probably seen this in movies, maybe as a torture device even. Some crazy psychiatrist who really likes hurting people straps someone up to an electroconvulsive therapy machine and zaps their brain. And so that's what a lot of our idea of what electroconvulsive therapy comes from those kinds of media portrayals. What it is a small electrical current into your brain that produces a brief seizure. Especially now, more than earlier in the time, it's very focused on where it's causing that seizure in the brain. So it's used still today, it is still used to treat major depressive disorder that hasn't responded to therapy, medicines, a bunch of different medicines, different therapies. So after you've kind of tried out all these things, you might, or if your symptoms are really, really bad, I mean, a psychiatrist might be like, hey, you should maybe try this first because your symptoms are this bad. So that could be possible too. So let's watch some videos of modern electroconvulsive therapy, as well as magnetic or transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS, because both of these are kind of doing the same thing. They're sending, well, the magnet one is doing it slightly differently, but the ECT is sending a little current to a specific part of the brain to start a seizure, and we'll see how that is actually done, and it's not this terrifying, scary experience that you might think it is. Probably should have started loading it before I finished talking.
My name is Irving Reddy, and I'm a psychiatrist and director of the brain stimulation program at Johns Hopkins Hospital. At our clinic, we treat patients with electroconvulsive therapy, also known as ECT, as well as transcranial magnetic stimulation. ECT is the most effective treatment we have for depression and other serious mental illnesses, but it causes memory loss and requires general anesthesia. Knowing more about how ECT works could help design non-convulsive forms of direct brain stimulation that are as effective as ECT, but that do not cause memory loss. My research focuses on learning more about how ECT works and developing alternate non-convulsive forms of brain stimulation. We use mouse models of depression and other conditions to learn about the molecular and circuit level changes in the brain that underlie the
So I was talking about, these are mouse neurons. Like you can see they're dyed, the neurons themselves are dyed so they're more easily visible. So this is a cell body, and that's some axon branches or dendrites, I'm not sure which. They look so similar. To me anyway, probably not to that researcher. You can probably tell you, oh yeah, that's absolutely the axon branch or the dendrite. But anyway, and just another interesting image of these connections. So he's saying we are using these and we're monitoring, like at the neural level, what are the connections doing, what is changing at the neural level, and how might that affect like humans' neural systems.
circuit level changes in the brain that underlie the therapeutic effects of brain stimulation.
All right, so let's jump to the next example. And this is a patient going through for ECT.
Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, is often called a treatment of last resort for patients who haven't had success with drug therapies, who have life-threatening psychiatric conditions, or who are suffering a catatonic state. ECT induces a brief seizure in a patient which resets the brain functions associated with some psychiatric disorders.
It's typically indicated for treatment-resistant psychiatric conditions, most commonly mood disorders or depression, but there are multiple types of depression, so it can also be used to treat bipolar depression.
The majority of ECT treatments are managed like outpatient procedures, and the patient is given general anesthesia.
When the patient's asleep, the stimulus is delivered, the seizure is monitored, they'll have just one seizure.
An electrical current is given to the brain, low enough not to harm the patient, but high enough to trigger a seizure. The treatment team can even touch the patient.
The thing that concerns patients the most is that they know that they will be having a seizure. They're concerned about what may be happening while they're either asleep or while they're having that seizure. And thanks to the anesthetic, it's very hard to tell. In fact, only way you can truly tell if they're having a seizure or not is to kind of monitor the motor activity and then monitor the EEG activity.
The patient awakens soon after and is monitored for a short while like any patient who has undergone general anesthesia. Within a half hour, they'll be discharged. In some cases, a handful of ECT treatments may be all that's needed to make medication therapy work. For other patients, regular recurring ECT treatments may be needed. In Morgantown for the WVU Health Report, I'm Dr. Wallace Sullivan.
So hopefully with this video you see some, let's make that quiet. So hopefully in this video you can see some things that we've talked about before. So this is a site, I wanted the picture of him with his coat. Where was that? Oh, here we go. So this is a psychiatrist. He's working within a hospital, so other psychiatric patients might just come to his office. He talks to them about the medicines they're taking and sends them on their way. For some, they might get ECT. So this patient is coming in getting an ECT treatment. So the psychiatrist comes down with them. They do the treatment in this hospital setting. There's a couple small electrodes. It's focusing where that seizure is starting in the brain. And they're talking about, I mean, it's a very lay term, resetting the brain. Like think about at the neural level, what is going to be happening when there's different or strange electrical charges. That's going to change how the neurons are acting. So we have our default networks that we just default to, that are our common memories or thoughts that are coming back up. As we're remembering something, we connect to another network. When we're experiencing another thing, other networks of neurons are working on that. So what this is doing is I mean, resetting isn't a bad word. It's kind of saying, hey, stop doing those networks, and then letting it restart running through networks again. So what that can do for a patient is it seems like it can reduce the strength of the connections that are leading to a lot of these depressive symptoms. So the neurons that are kind of running around in a spiral of depression are kind of getting weaker because other areas of the brain are getting stronger connections, and it's just changing at the neural level because new axons and dendrite branches are growing. So one short seizure in this little thing, or in this little time in the hospital, coming back and doing that for a couple weeks, you might be then at a different place with your neural circuitry where now the therapy and the medicines start to be effective enough that you don't need to do ECT anymore. The last one we'll show is transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it's the same idea behind it, but it's doing it in a little bit different way. Rather than inducing a seizure from just a more broad electrical shock, this is very directed at a specific part of the brain. So the electrodes, you can kind of cause the seizure to start in like the kind of bigger general areas in the brain, but it's still, the seizure generally is all over the brain, versus this is very, very focused and directed. Oops, I had the speakers off. Sorry. Let's do that again.
Each year, Americans spend more than $11 billion on antidepressants, but studies show they can be ineffective in up to 40% of all patients.
So, we talked about this earlier. Severe cases tend to do the best with medicine. So part of that stat is patients who didn't really need the medicine to have it be effective, like the treatment, the therapy was probably effective enough for them. But also there's cases that are bad enough that the medicine isn't working for it at all too. So it's kind of like in the upper middle range, medicines are effective, but then the very top range, these kind of therapies are effective, and in the bottom ranges of depression symptoms, therapy is the most effective. Although even when you're using this or therapy, or sorry, even if you're using this or medicines, you should still be using therapy as well because it shows better effects.
Holmes was one of them. They tried to adjust my medication, but the medication had side effects that were undesirable. Holmes is among the 16 million people in the U.S. who suffer major depressive episodes each year, a number that has increased 18% over the last decade, which is why some doctors at UCLA Health are taking a different approach. Here, doctors are beaming magnetic pulses deep inside patients' brains to change the way depression symptoms are perceived.
We are used to thinking of the brain as a chemical organ, but it's also an electrical organ. The idea that by using non-chemical means we can change the brain and how it functions.
It's called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS. It's currently FDA approved only to treat depression, but doctors say it may prove helpful in a wide range of conditions by rewiring a network of signals in the brain.
What TMS is doing is changing how that network functions, really rebooting the network to improve symptoms of mood, anxiety, and chronic pain.
Which may be why many patients treated for depression also say it helps relieve their pain, raising provocative questions about whether TMS could one day become a viable alternative to opioids.
This is a really transformative kind of therapy, but in medicine there's always the wish to do better, to help more people than what we do now.
But for now, it's made a dramatic difference in Bob's depression. It provided that kind of jolt to get my brain to start to work again normally. At UCLA Health, this is Clark Powell reporting.
So, essentially, you can think of this as like an opposite of an MRI. It's like focusing the magnets like at a specific area of your brain, so it can be a lot more focused. And again, this was recorded about 5 years ago now, so it'd be an interesting thing to do for a question paper, see where TMS is at this point. But that video is a really good one to show basically what it is. So that is electroconvulsive therapy, but there are also psychosurgeries. So we've talked about in history of psychology that prefrontal lobotomies were used on a lot of patients, especially institutionalized patients, throughout the 60s. And so you can see an image here of what's going on. There's essentially an ice pick inserted into a person's brain, and connections between the prefrontal cortex and the rest of the hemispheres of the brain were severed. So sometimes it was even used as a punishment for patients, or a patient who was admitted for institutionalization. They would have to sign a consent form saying, hey, to get released from the hospital, if the doctor decides I need a lobotomy, I consent to that, or else I cannot leave this hospital. So not super ethical, not a great thing to do. If you have to agree to a lobotomy before they release you, that sounds like kidnapping and torture to me. Which is why it's not done like that anymore. So essentially, this is destroying those connections, literally the neurons and their axons and their connections between that prefrontal cortex, the thalamus, other areas of the brain. So many patients essentially lost their personality, lost some of those goals that they had in the prefrontal cortex, that higher order thinking. For some, not enough was damaged, so they are still fairly the same as they were before, just had lower capacities. So it wasn't a great surgery, but it's an example of a psychosurgery. So modern psychosurgeries do still exist. They're used very rarely. So for OCD, depression, bipolar disorder, when the symptoms are really bad, you might use a modern psychosurgery. So let's watch a video of what a modern psychosurgery does. In some ways, it's really similar, but in many ways, you can tell it's very, very updated and very, very more well-researched and more controlled. So let's watch an example of a modern psychosurgery.
Tonight's Health Watch, encouraging news for people struggling with obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD.
Yeah, it's not drugs or talk therapy here. This is brain surgery. CBS 2's Dr. Max Gomez explains why this may be the best option for some. Dr. Max?
Yeah, that's right, Christine. You know, we've all seen some funny depictions of OCD. People who have to repeat certain routines like washing their hands or checking that the front door is locked over and over and over again. But severe OCD is no laughing matter. It's a disabling mental disorder. Randy Hurt has severe obsessive compulsive disorder. It became so bad he couldn't keep a job.
I needed to take a shower and I needed to do certain things. I needed to eat breakfast or whatever, regardless of how much time I had. I think it was 17 jobs in 4 years.
The obsession is something that is, the person knows is unusual and silly, but the person can't control it, and the thought itself causes marked distress.
The customary medication and talk therapy didn't work for Randy. Then his mother came across the possibility of surgery. It's called deep brain stimulation. Thin wire electrodes are inserted into tiny brain areas to disrupt nerve pathways that involve action, motivation, and reward processing. Small electrical currents disrupt the amount of reward a person assigns to their repetitive compulsive actions.
Patients are kind of fully awake at this stage, and we have a kind of a rating scale device where they rate how severe their OCD symptoms are at that time.
Over the next several weeks and months, the electrical settings are adjusted. Since his surgery 4 months ago, Randy can work on his car and mow the lawn, which he couldn't do before. But
I would like to work again at some point. I would like to get back to work.
I think we're just beginning to figure out the types of patients that we can help. And so I think there are quite a number of people that in the future are going to be helped by deep brain stimulation.
All right, I want to pause on that image of them doing the surgery. Come on. Oh, too far. So essentially here they've got this very focused and structured mechanism, so essentially there is a lack of human error that could happen here. So they're putting in electrodes into very specific parts within the neural pathways that they've mapped in this individual. So obviously we know some of the motivation and motion pathways and how they generally travel. You can even see through like MRIs where specifically we should put this in this individual, create this little thing so that we can stick this electrode into that specific area, have it with a little receiver data thing, a little computer that can, with a battery that can send that little shock. So that essentially what you've got there is similar in some ways to a cochlear implant. So where a cochlear implant that we talked about before, you've got a receiver outside the skull, and it's sending a signal to the nerves, to the neurons that are working, any hair cells that are working, to help a person hear. This is kind of the same thing. It's kind of a cochlear implant for inside the central nervous system, but its purpose is a little different, to kind of disrupt the pathways of that reward that you're getting from the OCD symptom. So when you have that OCD, you have that compulsion to do a certain action. If you then are not feeling as rewarded, or you're not feeling that compulsion as bad, your symptoms are going to decrease remarkably. So this is in modern day psychosurgery, hospital setting. There's not a person shoving an ice pick into your head. They're still shoving an electrode into your head. But in some ways, for especially the general anesthetic is a pretty dangerous part of some of those depression treatments, the ECT. Obviously, a major surgery like this, there's a lot of safety concerns too. But it's a lot different than what psychosurgery used to be. And it's a lot more effective because it's more focused on the actual things that are the problem. And there's more research being done into how to do these things better. So even 10 years, 20 years, 50 years from now, there's going to be better treatments. So sociocultural approaches, we'll just barely touch on this. There's not as much focus on research here because it's hard to kind of find generalizable things that work in all cultures and all societies. So the emphasis here is on the various cultural factors. So you might have group therapy, family and couples therapy, people from your same community who have similar problems that can support each other, kind of doing support groups, self-help, community mental health. Those are all really sociocultural approaches, and they're a good combination with, let's say you might be going to cognitive behavioral therapy for depression. You also have a group that is suffering from depression and talking about things that they did. Try to motivate each other, be there for each other, and support each other. Group therapy, generally they're sharing the same kind of disorder, so anxiety, depression, alcoholism, something like that. Usually there are patients that are further along, that are like almost done with their program, like they feel like their symptoms are gone, and others that are new, so they can kind of see that and have that motivation. Hey, George or Jenny are doing really well. They say they had the same symptoms as me, or I saw them 6 months ago. They were in the same place. Now they're going to be done. That can be really helpful for someone to see. Family and couples therapy, it might be using a lot of these techniques: psychodynamic therapy, humanistic, cognitive behavioral, but bringing in other family members, things like that. So oftentimes for any of these therapies in the sociocultural approach, you're going to combine a lot of different therapy types to integrate them to work for in specific individuals. Yeah, we've kind of said all these things. So with that, a competent therapist should be aware of cultural differences, individualistic versus collectivist cultures, differences in the cultures in different countries and areas. So with that, there doesn't necessarily need to be an ethnicity match between a client and a therapist, or like a gender match between client and therapist, as long as the therapist is competent. You don't need to find someone that looks like you and has had your experience to have it be an effective therapist. You really need that therapeutic alliance, someone that knows enough that they can do well for you, and you and them are working together to get better. So if you do want specific feminist focused therapies, those do definitely exist though too. So and you can also try different therapists out. So that is chapter 13. I know we went in a lot more detail on psychotherapies, even more so than drugs, and even more so than sociocultural approaches. But hopefully that gives you a lot of good ideas. And that was chapter 13. I'll see you again on the next chapter that we're covering, which I think is chapter 9, Motivation and Emotion. But double check your syllabus to make sure.